Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston. We're wrapping up 2023 today with our traditional end-of-year interview with Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. P. Sean Garney is going to be here to speak about what he sees coming up on the regulatory landscape in Washington in the next year. As usual, there's plenty going on. I think when I look over the diesel market in this past year, that what sticks out are the margins. Yes, we can talk about how the outright price rose sharply and then fell, but let's face it, you can hear about that in a lot of places. Here, given the FreightWaves audience, we're going to talk about diesel. The margin is quite simply the difference between the price of crude and the price of diesel, or the price of crude and the price of gasoline. In some ways, you can almost view 2023 as the first normal year since 2019. That may sound strange. 2020 obviously wasn't normal, and there still was a COVID hangover in 2021. In 2022, you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine that blew markets out of any sort of normalcy, though that eventually mostly receded. And so, yes, this year you had the war in the Middle East, but that affected exactly zero oil production, though I do need to note here that as I'm recording this, oil transit is skipping the Suez Canal, and that is certainly adding as much as 2 weeks transit time, and that could be a bullish factor for oil. With the chaos in the market all these years, it was always hard to figure out just what was the price impact of IMO 2020. You remember that rule. It is the regulation that went into effect in 2020, naturally, and it requires much stricter sulfur limits in marine fuels. The primary method of getting to that was going to be the creation of a new product called very low sulfur fuel oil. And the way to make that VLSFO, as it's known, was to take distillate molecules that would otherwise go into the manufacture of diesel or other distillate products like heating oil, and instead make VLSFO. You can see where this might have been concerning in terms of driving up the price of diesel. I wrote several stories for FreightWaves in 2019 about the impending change and when it might hit diesel markets. And in the fall of 2019, there were some signals in the diesel market that maybe the spread between crude and diesel was starting to expand and that IMO 2020 was the likely culprit. Of course, when 2020 hit, we know what happened. Outside of toilet paper, we were suddenly awash with everything. Most of all, I'd say most of all, oil. That raised the question with the diesel spread never blowing out. Was that because of COVID, or was it because the concerns about IMO 2020 were all false? We're about to close the books on a year that I think could be described, as I said, as somewhat normal. Okay, it was volatile, but oil is always volatile. And what do the markets show? If you take a basic spread between crude and ultra-low sulfur diesel on the CME Commodity Exchange, that spread in 2019 averaged about 41 cents per gallon. In 2002, when diesel was certainly considered elevated by the fact that a major supplier, Russia, was shut out of a lot of markets during the year, that spread averaged about $1.18 per gallon. This year, that spread so far has averaged about 85 cents per gallon. Its highest spread was about $1.20, in other words, a level about equal to last year's average. I am sort of ready to declare this year the new norm. Did IMO 2020 finally work its way so thoroughly through the market that it has doubled diesel's average spread against crude? This matters to users because it means that the fuel that drives the transportation sector is now going to be permanently elevated relative to crude, and there's no reason to believe that other costs are necessarily going to follow suit. Diesel has the capability of being relatively more expensive than anything else. What can fix this? Maybe nothing. Maybe more refining capacity. The world is anticipating the opening in 2024 of the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. It is an absolute giant at 650,000 barrels per day. But in particular, it is aimed at producing lots of gasoline, so while there may be new diesel capacity, it isn't enormous. There are other refinery projects expected to see the light of day in 2022, but Dangote is the biggest. What this means is that you know how people will look at the prices on the corner station and say, man, can you believe how much more expensive diesel is than gasoline? I remember when it used to be the other way around. Yes, that is true. And you know what? It's not likely to go back. It has become a tradition here on Drilling Deep that we wrap up the year with Scopelitis Consulting and talk to them about their views on the coming year and maybe what happened this prior year that just is wrapping up. It used to be Dave Ocecki who would visit with us, and now it's P. Sean Garney. He's the co-director at Scopelitis Transportation Consulting, and we just kind of like to sort of spin the globe or spin the wheel with him at this time of the year, and we'll spin the steering wheel, actually, I guess, Sean, is the best way to say it, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
So anyway, thanks for joining us here on Drilling Deep. We're going to talk about the end of 2023 and going into 2024. What do you think was the biggest story in 2023, at least from like your perspective? You're down there in Washington. What was the biggest sort of regulatory issue that you saw brewing in 2023 that presumably is going to spill over into next year?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. I mean, I think the story that got the most traction through the year and perhaps produced, a fair amount of anxiety was the spattering of news on speed limiters and the sort of second AMPRM the second supplemental notice that we got and the upcoming notice that we're expecting as a potential Christmas gift, air quotes, gift to the industry here at the end of the year. I think that was probably what got some of the most traction or some of the most anxiety in the industry. The one thing that I thought was probably one of the bigger deals throughout the year was the Valentine's Day gift that we got this year in 2023, which was FMCSA's proposed changes to the CSA program. I think those will have some pretty long legs too.
All right, let's go back to the speed limit. Now, this is not legislation we're talking about. This would be an FMCSA rule, correct?
Correct, though there's been a lot of talk on the Hill about it too. So that's what's making it such a high visibility issue. FMCSA is expected to finally, sometime soon or maybe early in the new year, expected to finally give us their proposal, a notice of proposed rulemaking that is supposed to outline the speed at which they think commercial motor vehicles should be traveling. And there's just a lot of anxiety in the industry, much of who don't want any speed to be stipulated at all. Just waiting for this to sort of come down. It has become less of an issue, I think, about, how fast our trucks should drive and more of an issue about the length of government oversight or the weight of government oversight and what's appropriate. So it's sort of becoming this proxy argument for, I think, a larger discussion.
Right. As you noted, there's a good chunk of people out there who want zero limit on this. Is there a number?
And it's not because they want to drive fast too.
Well,
I know that. They don't want to drive fast. They're just sick of having to, worry about this mandate, and that's frustrating.
Okay, what is there's no number yet. There's no proposal yet. We don't know what it is. From what you guess, from what you gather, where do you think that number might come in at?
68, good sir. I think 68. There was the rumors that FMCSA had made an error when updating their unified agenda, had included 68 in there. And then there were all these stories about, we know the speed, it's going to be 68, it's going to be 68. And then, of course, FMCSA walked it back, and many of the other advocates in the space were like, hey, for sure, we don't know what the speed's going to be. I do think 68 is a reasonable spot if they have to pick one. It's higher than 65. I live out here in the Midwest, and the speed limit in South Dakota is 80 on the expressway. And many of the interstates around here have higher limits. So it's going to have to be, I think, higher than 65, 70. People start to get a little scary, or a little scared. We'll see if they end up wanting to bifurcate it in a way that the American Trucking Associations had called for, which would give you a slightly higher top speed if you employ these types of technologies. I personally don't think that is something they'll necessarily consider, because it will, just by virtue of the nature of the rule, advantage larger carriers over smaller carriers. And I don't think FMCSA is interested in doing that. So if you wanted some unfounded prognostication, John, for your podcast, Sean Garney says 68.
Now, how does this advantage bigger carriers? I mean, in the sense of regulation, I don't care what industry it's in. regulation always helps the big boys because they are more financially stable, more financially solid to handle the cost of the regulation. But specifics, what are some of the ways in which larger carriers could benefit from this? And I think it's significant because, you could imagine a move on the part of larger carriers to start advocating for this because they see that it's maybe an advantage over their smaller competitors.
The competitive landscape on the speed limiter issue is very interesting. I mean, if you think if FMCSA would choose to say, hey, if I've got, this adaptive cruise control technology on my truck or whatever the case may be, then I may drive faster. That technology comes with a cost that not all players in the marketplace can bear. And so if now all of a sudden I get 2 extra miles per hour, that's a big deal. Of course, in the very beginning when, larger carriers began adopting on their own accord these speed limiters, they were doing that for cost control considerations, right? They wanted to make sure that that they could have the most optimal miles per gallon from a fuel spend perspective, and started to see the safety benefits and started to encourage the rest of the industry to sort of consider and adopt those. Of course, the smaller motor carriers, they don't have those economies of scale, right? They don't have the ability to change their routes or assign new trucks. When they pick up a load, they have to pick up a load. They have to, they have to deliver it on time. And so for them, those extra few miles per gallon or those extra few miles per hour could make the difference between getting their next load or not. And if they don't get their next load, now they're out searching again. Whereas, larger carriers tend to have larger networks and can reinside trucks and drivers and can absorb that sort of impact a little bit better. So there's definitely a competitive element happening here on speed limiters.
Kind of on a personal side, my prior employer, who had a pretty big T&E budget, I used to get a private car to the airport, and I used to travel quite a bit. And I always noticed that, and it was his car, it was his company. I always noticed that he was fairly moderate in how fast he could go, even when he'd take me to the airport at some ungodly hour or pick me up from it at some ungodly hour, and the roads were fairly wide open. He would moderate his speed. I've noticed since I've gone over to Uber as my way of transporting to the airport that a lot of them just drive hell-bent. They want to get there as fast as possible. And maybe they could argue with you that by getting one route done, it puts them in position to sooner claim another route. So it's a really interesting calculation.
Yeah, I mean, they're under very similar pressures. They need turns. That's how they're going to make their money. And really, if you're playing the long game, which you should be, every minute counts.
Is this the kind of thing that you would imagine Congress stepping in and trying to just outright block if the FMCA rule goes through? I mean, there are ways that the legislative body can step in and put a halt to or modify what the regulatory agencies are doing. Would you imagine that this is fertile territory for that?
Well, it's certainly been talked a lot about, and we just saw the hearing, I think it was last week, a big hearing with the major trucking players that are, setting out their arguments for speed limiters. And we know that there's been bills introduced into Congress and tried to append to appropriations bills that could scuttle this. None of those bills really have enough support today, I don't feel, to make it across the finish line. But they are going to inform the political debate without a doubt. I mean, we are going into a presidential election year, so we can expect, the wheels of the congressional machine to grind to a halt, which means if they do want to pass something on speed limiters, they're going to have to get, creative about adding it to appropriations bills that may or may not pass or other, must pass pieces of legislation. So do I think it's impossible? No. Do I think it's probable? No. Do I think that hearing all of this on the Hill could ultimately impact the outcome of the rule? Absolutely. I mean, that's how the rule and advocacy game is played.
Now, speaking of FMCSA, we had a lot of turmoil in the upper echelons of it. We had several acting administrators, and now we've had Robin Hutchin, who I guess for really most of the year now, right? I mean, her tenure is more than a year. What's your verdict on her?
I have really appreciated her willingness to come and to sit in the hot seat to speak to the industry. I think that's been very good. All of the feedback I've heard from FMCSA headquarters staff has been excellent from that standpoint. So I think she's trying hard to do things that are very important to her. And congratulations on that. She's working on. She just issued that notice on domestic violence and domestic abuse, which I think is going to be really important to making our truck stops safer and that those sorts of things. Make sure that those folks that are committing assaults in commercial motor vehicles feel the repercussions for that. I think that's important too. Certainly interjecting a lot of Biden's interest in equality and environmental support into the agenda. She's been doing her job there from that perspective. So I've been happy. I mean, we can tell that it's a Democratic administration, so we shouldn't be blind to that. But her leadership, I think, has been strong, and you can tell that from the pace at which we've been hearing more from FMCSA throughout the year, right? So seems like they've got their feet back under them, and I guarantee you they're going to be pushing very hard in 2024 to accomplish as much of their agenda as they can before the election.
I want to correct myself. I called her Robin Hutchin because I know somebody by that last name, but of course it's Robin Hutchinson. Hutchison, yeah. Correct.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about, again, spinning the globe, some other issues. I'm going to read some leads from the work of my colleague John Gallagher, who covers Washington. This is a fairly recent one. Trucking companies should be better protected against unpaid claims that are due them from brokers under a new rule issued by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I think this is a growing out of bankruptcies that have left a lot of carriers holding the bag.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're just making sure, and it is this, the rulemaking came out, and it's a smaller percentage of the industry, but it's certainly there to make sure that brokers and freight forwarders carry that bond that they must carry in case they have a spend down in cash and need to wind down and help protect those carriers that, like you said, are absolutely holding the bag. So that was the final rule that came out in the fall. I think it'll be important.
All right, this is another one. If drivers have to be federally regulated by hours of service rules, which of course they do, brokers should be required to pay drivers for time lost waiting to pick up freight because it ends up making roads less safe. Now, there's not a rule proposal on this. This is just an argument of a group of owner-operators and smaller trucking companies, and FMCSA is kind of planning a study on the effect of detention. Where do you kind of stand on that? What are your thoughts there?
Oof, that's a big one too. The detention time study, I think, is going to be very important, and we've done it before. We studied it before, and we know that for every additional 15 minutes of detention time, there's some safety consequence there. The ultimate question is, what can we do about it? And I think the study that's going to come out of FMCSA will tell us how bad the problem is, what the impacts of the problem is, and among various sectors and that sort of thing. But the real question that folks are trying to answer is, what do we do then? What can FMCSA do? What can Congress do? What can the government generally do with a market problem? Because really when it comes down to is who's got the leverage and when to determine how long freight sits on docks. And how and should the government play in that? So do I think FMCSA would regulate, would require that certain people be paid at certain times? I don't really think they're into the pay business, but would Congress do it? Sure. We've seen things floated through Congress to say, that anything over 2 hours needs to be paid to the carrier. The carrier needs to pass it through to the driver. But, is that focusing on the symptom of the problem? The question is, how do we fix the problem? It has lots of tails, and part of that is that drivers aren't getting their full freight on detention time, and that causes a problem. But we need to fix the problem, which is detention time, which is ultimately a market-based problem. So I think we're going to learn a lot about it, and we're going to learn new ways that the government might be able to help us, if they should help us. It's an ongoing debate, right? It's a 3-year study, so it's a long tail on this one. We'll just have to keep watching it.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's been an issue that's been kicking around for a long time. So yeah. Let me throw one more out at you. Again, reading from my colleague John Gallagher's work, trailer side guard rule likely delayed until at least October 2024. That was the headlines. DOT's latest regulatory agenda reveals regulators will be taking no action on a costly new safety equipment proposal for almost a year. I mean, I seem to recall writing a story about side guard underride protection as one of my first stories at FreightWaves.
Oh,
that
wow.
was back in 2018.
Yeah.
You can see there's not a lot of progress since then.
Yeah, certainly, and that rule came out, and it was such an interesting one to come out because the cost benefit was completely upside down, which surprised everybody. The lives saved versus the cost of equipping these vehicles was just not straight. It's not terribly unusual for an agency to take so long to go from NPRM to final or in between rulemaking steps, but this one is particularly difficult for them because they're going to have to find ways to justify that rule. I mean, we could ultimately see them. We recall with the first speed limiter NPRM in 2016, they didn't justify that rule based on safety either. They justified it based on environmental impact. So if they find it important to continue to move forward on this one, then we could see that sort of cost benefit come out of the agencies. But we'll just have to see. Congress said you need to start working on this, but you also need to study it. So which one should come first and how should they both finish up is an open question. So I'm not too terribly worried about side guards right now.
Let me ask two cost questions, kind of like that. What does it cost to equip a truck with a side underride? And then let's go back to earlier in the interview. What does it cost to equip a truck with a speed limiter?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Speed limiters are already equipped, so trucks have governors. They're just not activated, right? So as I understand it, the cost to the carrier from an implementation or from an implementation standpoint would probably not be too onerous. Their costs are going to come from lost productivity, obviously. And on the side guard question, I'm not sure the specific cost of equipping those. I know that there's certainly a difference between those aerodynamic wings and something strong enough to withstand, a 35 mile an hour, T-bone collision by a vehicle. And that would certainly enhance the cost there. But we're not even sure what the final form of those types of technologies would be ultimately, because there'd be a lot of consideration. So I'm not sure of the cost. I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure people know it, but
I think some of the opposition on cost is not necessarily the cost of the underride equipment, but it's dragging it around, which is more weight, which hurts fuel efficiency. I mean, that's kind of like one of the counter arguments to doing this. That's where the cost is, not necessarily putting in the underride equipment itself.
Yeah, and there's the inspection of that equipment and the inspection of the parts of the trailer behind those guards that are necessary as well. I mean, there's certainly going to be a lot of additional ancillary cost to those, and we just have to discern what the cost versus the benefits are and if there's a technological and a different technological solution to solving the same problem.
All right, let's ask one last question then. Maybe we'll have another one. But what is the regulatory issue in 2024 that you think right now might be flying a little bit under the radar that you think might become a significant issue next year?
Yeah, so here's how I think 2024 plays out in some ways. If you could look at the regulatory agenda and say, all right, here's the big regulatory things to watch. And I jotted down a few notes, and obviously we had speed limiters, safety fitness determination rulemaking, which is how FMCSA rates motor carriers, an NPRM on automated driving systems. But I think what's going to make a bigger difference in carriers' lives is the things that FMCSA is going to do from a non-regulatory perspective. So they're really working hard to overhaul the way that they identify less safe motor carriers and how they commit to enforcing the rules against those. And I think earlier this year, we saw a whole bunch of things that will really inform what's going to happen. We saw the proposed changes to CSA, right? And remember, these are not rules. This is just FMCSA making announcements about how they intend to enforce the rules. So we've got that one. We've got FMCSA's proposed changes to the data queues process. So how do we create a more fair data queue process whereby we don't have to live with that final determination that was made by the officer, sometimes made by the officer who wrote the ticket. Instead, we might be able to appeal those to a higher court, so to speak. There's the crash preventability program. So FMCSA has that crash preventability determination program whereby motor carriers can contest crashes that fit specific scenarios to have FMCSA deem them as not preventable. That should expand next year. So that's going to make an impact on carriers and carriers' CSA scores. And then finally, what FMCSA is doing now from an enforcement perspective with CVSA, beginning to test level 8 inspections. And this is going to be an absolute game changer when it happens. But a level 8 inspection is a at speed in motion inspection, right? A collection of information. Right now, it looks like a sort of a level 3 inspection, right? Driver credential type things. They're starting to, they're starting to pilot it this year, meaning they're finding carriers willing to install equipment that can transmit data automatically to roadside enforcement so that they can eventually use that to determine if there's a violation there, a reason to pull the carrier. And 2 phases of that going to happen next year. First, the transmitting data, and then how do we collect the data? How do we determine if there's violations in that data? I think that is absolutely, the results of that are going to be very important to the industry, and they're going to change the way that we understand how we need to comply with the regulations. So we have such a big regulatory structure that's been built up over the years. Now, a lot of things that we see are just, hey, how do we manage that? What is that going to look like to motor carriers to comply with those things? And I think we'll continue to see a lot of changes from FMCSA from that perspective.
Yeah, trucks are throwing off massive millions of data points, and the more ways that the world figures out what to do with them, it's going to be really better off for everybody. I think you might agree with that.
Mm-hmm. I do 100%.
So while you were talking, I did the calculation in my head, and we're going to have you back on December 20th next year. I think
perfect.
That'll be the last Drilling Deep for 2024, and we'll have lots to talk about.
Okay, great. Yeah, it should be interesting. We'll see how the election goes, and boy, yeah. It'll be a good one.
We want to thank Pishaw and Garney of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting for joining us here today to wrap up the year on Drilling Deep. We've been doing this now. We had about our 4th anniversary a couple of weeks ago, so I never really could have imagined that we'd be at this point after all those years. My colleague Tim Dooner says most podcasts don't last 10 episodes, but we've done a little more than that. So anyway, we want to thank all of you who have watched or listened to Drilling Deep here in 2023. We'll be back the first week of January to keep going. We are part of the FreightCast family of podcasts from FreightWaves. You can find us on all the leading podcast platforms. And if you're watching Sean and I, you're watching it on YouTube. I want to thank South Turk for being our production associate all this year. Great job, South. Thanks for putting up with me when I need to make changes. We want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year. See you in 2024.